Normandy, July 1944. A German rifleman from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division is positioned at the base of a hedgerow east of St-Lo. He is wearing a splinter-patterned smock printed on waterproof cotton duck. This is the camouflage that the SSVT Deutschland Regiment had field-tested in 1937 and that the German High Command estimated would reduce casualties by 15%. His helmet is covered, his face is darkened, and the brush around him remains undisturbed. He has been in this position for nearly 6 hours. He has not moved, he has not coughed, and he has done everything the German army taught him to do. Then, without anyone seeing him, without anyone walking down the lane in front of him, without any patrol coming through the gate or any spotter pointing him out, an 81mm mortar round detonates 10 feet above his position. Then another, then another. The head shreds, the earth lifts, and the rifleman is killed where he lay. His squad mate, captured later and sent to the rear for interrogation by 1st U.S. Army G2, tells the interrogators something that will appear in different words in dozens of reports filed across the American sector this summer. He says, in essence, we were not seen. It is a strange complaint from a prisoner of war. He is not claiming the Americans missed. He is claiming they found him without finding him. He had done his job, his camouflage had done its job, and yet he was dead in his hedgerow. 6 weeks earlier, the same camouflage system designed by the same Munich art professor had been killing British infantry at a frightful rate east of Camo. British, Canadian, and Polish casualties in Normandy reached 83,000 by the end of August, with 16,000 killed. Much of that loss was due to weapons fired from positions the attacker never saw. The camouflage worked. The Germans were ghosts in the hedgerows. The British were paying for it in blood. So how is it that the same ghosts against a different army suddenly stopped being ghosts? The answer is not about American eyes being sharper. It is not about American scout snipers being better trained. It is not even about American camouflage doctrine, which barely existed. The answer is about something the Germans could not see in either sense. A different theory of what it meant to find an enemy. And to understand it, we have to go back to a school in the Oklahoma desert where 2 American majors started asking a question the rest of the world thought was the wrong question. What if you didn't have to see the enemy at all? Start with the camouflage itself, because this is the piece of the puzzle most easily underestimated. In 1931, the Reichswehr issued a 4-color disruptive pattern called splitter-tarnmuster. It featured hard-edged green and brown polygons over a tan or gray background with vertical green dashes printed across the top to suggest rain. The pattern was originally meant for the Dreiecksbahn, the triangular shelter quarter every German soldier carried. By the late 30s, it had been adapted into smocks, helmet covers, and Luftwaffe jump uniforms. But the truly sophisticated work came out of the Waffen-SS Research Unit. An SS major named Wim Brandt, an engineer commanding the SS Reconnaissance Battalion, went looking in 1935 for better camouflage and found a Munich art professor named Johann Georg Otto Schick. Schick had spent years studying how light moves through trees in different seasons. He understood that the human eye locks onto sharp edges and consistent shapes, and that a uniform breaks down in vision when it has neither. Schick designed patterns the world had never seen on a battlefield. Eigelmuster, oak leaf, Platinenmuster, plain tree, Rauchtarnmuster, blurred edge. They were not painted as polygons, they were painted as light. He used organic, irregular shapes meant to mimic the dappled shadow of summer canopy. And then he did something almost no one else had thought to do at scale. He made the smocks reversible. One side green for summer, flip it, brown for autumn. In 1937, the SS 5T Deutschland Regiment ran field trials on the new garments. The estimate that came back was that the camouflage would reduce casualties by 15%. The patents were filed in 1938. By the time German paratroopers landed in Crete in 1941, the cream of the Wehrmacht had access to clothing that was, by a long way, the most sophisticated soldier-level camouflage on Earth. Now picture what this looked like in Normandy in June of 1944. A Waffen-SS Panzer Grenadier from the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Youth, settles into a hedgerow north of Caen. He is wearing oak leaf pattern, green side out. Around him are 6-foot earthen banks topped with brambles and hawthorn trees that have grown there since the Roman occupation. The sunken lanes are so deep and so tunneled by foliage that one Scottish reconnaissance officer, Dennis Bunn, of the 15th Reconnaissance Regiment, wrote of seeing or suspecting danger in every blade of grass. The German is dug into the bank itself beneath the roots in a fighting position with a tunnel through the embankment so he can fire from either side. The Imperial War Museum's own account describes British infantry advancing against an almost invisible enemy. Almost invisible. That is the exact phrase. Not well concealed, not hard to spot, invisible. The British paid for it. Their casualties by June 30th stood at 24,698. By July 25th, the number had risen above 46,000. Mortar fire accounted for 3/4 of British casualties. Fire from German tubes positioned 3,000 or 4,000 yards behind the front line, directed by observers the British infantry never saw. The defensive system consisted of light forward positions on the crest of every hedgerow, with mortars and artillery dialed in to drop on top of them the moment the British went over. Why don't we talk much about how good German camouflage was? Probably because the story that survives the war is the story of the winners, and the winners had a different system. But by any neutral measurement, what the Germans had built was the best soldier concealment system in the world. In the right terrain, against the right enemy, it was working. And the right enemy in Normandy was the British. The British army did not lack for skill. It did not lack for courage. It was full of veterans of North Africa, of Italy, of Crete. What it had doctrinally was something the Germans were intimately equipped to exploit. The British way of fighting in Normandy was deliberate, step-by-step set piece. A British attack began with a careful artillery plan, lifted onto the objective by a rolling barrage, and was followed by infantry who advanced in disciplined fire in movement onto a positively identified enemy position. Lieutenant General Guy Simonds called this the bite and hold doctrine, and within that doctrine, the smallest unit decision was tactical. See the target, suppress the target, close on the target. This sequence required one thing above all others. You had to see the target. The Imperial War Museum's own historians acknowledge that British formations exhibited more caution than may have been warranted, and that troops were often only too ready to go to ground and call in artillery support even when facing fairly limited opposition. Max Hastings in Overlord framed it more bluntly. The Allies, especially the British, were cautious and slow-moving. The Germans were faster, more aggressive, and exceptionally good at being exceptionally good. Hastings' argument was not that the British performed badly. It was that the Germans performed astonishingly well in the kind of fight the British were prepared to give them. And the kind of fight the British were prepared to give them was a fight in which the camouflaged man was the lethal man. A British rifle section equipped with 8 Lee Enfield bolt-action rifles and a single Bren-Light machine gun operated on the assumption that you would close to a position you had identified, suppress what you found, and kill the men you could see. If the men were not seen, you could not close. You could be killed instead. This was the world German camouflage had been designed for, and it was the world in which German camouflage worked. But 6 weeks into the campaign, something started showing up in the interrogation reports that did not make sense inside that world. A corporal of the 275th Infantry Division captured during the hedgerow fighting and questioned by U.S. interrogators said something the Army's combat lesson series recorded verbatim. Americans use infantry cautiously. It sounds like a compliment. It is not. The same prisoners reported that American artillery barrages were not always followed up by aggressive infantry attacks. The Germans were noting from inside their own foxholes that the Americans did not have to send the infantry in to find them. The Americans were finding them anyway, or more precisely killing them, without ever bothering to look. How that was possible, how an army the Germans themselves described as cautious with its infantry was somehow more lethal to camouflage men than the army of veterans across the river, is where the story turns. Cayenne, late June 1944. Operation Epsom is grinding to a halt in fields southwest of the city. The British 15th Scottish Division is trying to outflank Caen by punching south across the Odon. They are well led. They have armored brigades attached, and they are bleeding. What is killing them is not the panzer divisions in the front line. The German front line is, by deliberate design, lightly held. What is killing them is a system of a few well-camouflaged forward observers, a few MG-42 teams in concealed positions on reverse slopes, and 3,000 to 4,000 yards back, Nebelwerfer rocket batteries and 81mm mortar tubes. The forward men do not need to engage the British decisively. They only need to identify where the British are. The mortars do the rest. To understand why this worked, we need to understand how the British attack was actually structured. The British rifle section was 8 to 10 men. It had a corporal and a lance corporal, a Bren gun on a bipod, and bolt-action Lee Enfields capable of perhaps 15 aim shots a minute in trained hands. The section attacked in two groups. The Bren team laid down suppressive fire. The rifle group closed with the enemy. This was fire and movement reduced to its sharpest form, taught in British battle schools since 1937, and refined in North Africa and Italy. But it was a method designed against an enemy you could find. The Bren laid down suppressive fire on something. The rifle group closed on something. If the something could not be located, the whole sequence stalled. In the con sector, the somethings were ghosts. A Scottish veteran of the Odin Valley fighting, quoted in Stephen Bull and Gordon Rotman's study of British infantry tactics, recalled the moment before assault. If a German soldier appeared, everybody fired at him. Everybody. The phrase tells you how rare it was for a German soldier to actually appear. The German was inside the hedge beneath the bank, hooded under his chic-designed smock with the green side out, looking through a slit at the moving British line. He did not appear. He fired and someone died. He did not fire again until he had moved. So the British, properly trained, did exactly what good infantry should do. They went to ground. They radioed for support. And while they were on the ground waiting for the support to arrive, the German mortars in the rear opened up. The forward observers in their hides had already passed the coordinates back. The British had been seen. They had not seen. That asymmetry, seeing versus being seen, is the heart of what the camouflage system was selling. It bought the German riflemen a one-shot advantage. It bought the German MG team a 30-second window before British eyes located the muzzle flash. Most importantly, it bought the German rear observers the time and concealment they needed to keep delivering coordinates to the mortar lines. The whole chain of German lethality depended on the front man being invisible long enough to set up the back man's kill. Against the British way of war, this was almost a perfect mechanism. The British were not slow because they were British. They were slow because the German camouflage system made fast lethal. The fast units, like the British 7th Armored Spearhead at Villers-Bocage in mid-June, were ambushed and decimated. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann's Tiger destroyed numerous British vehicles in a single engagement, and one reason was that nothing in the British column saw him until his first round was already in the air. He had been in a perfectly concealed position behind hedgerows. The British Armored Division had been doing what British Armored Divisions did, advancing methodically toward a confirmed location, and a hidden enemy of one Tiger and a handful of supporting tanks had broken open the head of the column before any British vehicle even returned fire. But here is the part no one across the lines had figured out yet. The American soldier did not believe in finding the enemy first. Let me say that again, because everything that follows depends on it. The American rifle section, the American platoon, the American company, all the way up, did not, as a matter of fundamental doctrine, treat target acquisition as the precondition for fire. The American manuals, the American training, the entire American way of fighting in Normandy was built on a different proposition. If there is somewhere the enemy might be, you fire on it, whether you can see him or not. That proposition is what was sitting across the Bocage from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division and the 12th SS in July of 1944. And the men who wore Otto Schick's perfect oak leaf camouflage were about to find out what it does to your career to be invisible to an enemy that does not care whether it can see you. The names of soldiers like the riflemen from the 3rd Fallschirmjäger have been mostly lost. We have the unit records, the casualty returns, the interrogation logs. We do not have the diaries. If your father or grandfather served in the U.S. First Army that summer, and you remember stories about the hedgerow fighting, I would be honored to read them in the comments. Those small details are what survive when the official histories have moved on. Walk back 20 years before D-Day to Fort Benning, Georgia, in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. The men there were not thinking about the Bocage. They were not thinking about Otto Schick's camouflage patents. They were thinking, in the limited budgets of the interwar years, about something more fundamental. They were thinking about volume. The American infantry doctrine that emerged from the late 20s and the 30s was built around a particular insight. In modern combat, the enemy is mostly invisible. He is in a trench, he is in a hedgerow, he is in a building. The fantasy of two ranks exchanging aimed fire at visible silhouettes was a Napoleonic memory. What actually happened in real combat, as the Army's small arms studies of the First World War had documented in detail, was that infantry on both sides spent most of their time engaging suspected positions. The shots that did the killing were the shots that happened to land in the place where an enemy was, regardless of whether the shooter could see him. Out of this came two decisions that determined the kind of war the American riflemen would fight in 1944. The first decision was the M1 Garand. The semi-automatic rifle was adopted as the standard infantry weapon in 1936, and it was the only one of its kind to be issued as standard kit by any major army during the entire war. A trained American rifleman could fire 24 aim shots per minute. A trained British rifleman with a Lee Enfield could fire 15. The official German Kar 98K rate was lower still. The American number was the everyday number, and the rifle reloaded itself. Multiply that across a squad. A 12-man American rifle squad with one Browning automatic rifle and 11 M1 Garands could put approximately 300 rounds downrange in a minute. A British rifle section of 10 men with one Bren gun and 8 Lee Enfields could put perhaps 150 to 180 rounds out in the same window. And the British number was practical only against a known target because firing bolt-action rifles in volume meant the men were not also looking, not also moving, not also covering arcs. The American squad was not just twice as loud. It was a different kind of unit. It could afford to fire blind. The second decision was a tactical one, and it had a clinical name. The U.S. Army called it speculative fire. The combat troops called it reconnaissance by fire. The doctrine in the field manuals of the period was direct. Shoot at likely enemy positions to provoke a reaction that confirms the presence and position of enemy forces. In Normandy, this had specific instructions. When U.S. armored columns advanced, they trained their cannon and machine guns alternately left and right of the axis of advance, firing more or less continuously at any suspected enemy positions as they appeared. Tank infantry teams approaching a hedgerow would comb the foliage with machine gun fire before the infantry stepped through the gap. Supply trucks running through partially cleared country mounted 50 caliber M2 Brownings on the cab and used them the same way. The Army's own post-war studies were explicit. When tanks led an attack, they must use their guns for reconnaissance by fire, and approaches to hedgerows should comb them with machine gun fire. Read that and think about what it meant from the German side. Imagine you are Otto Schick's prize student. You're wearing his oak leaf pattern smock, the green side out. You're in a hedgerow position so well prepared that even your divisional commander could walk past it without seeing you. And the first thing that happens, first time American forces approach your sector, is that a Sherman tank fires its coaxial machine gun in a long burst across your hedge before any infantryman has even looked at it. The bullets cut the foliage. The bullets cut you. There was no patrol. There was no scout. There was no spotter. The Sherman did not stop to wonder whether you were there. It treated you as already there, and it killed you on the assumption. This is the puzzle from inside the German foxhole. The soldier dies. His comrades, 2 hedgerows back, are interrogated later. They tell American officers something that, when you translate it, comes out as, "We cannot understand how he was identified." By the German theory of how a soldier gets killed in combat, identification has to come first. The American theory had simply skipped that step. But the small arms picture was only half of it. The other half was operating at a scale no German camouflage was ever designed to defeat. To understand it, we have to leave the rifle squad behind and walk back to the gun line. When U.S. forces engaged German positions in Normandy, the riflemen's bar and garand were almost a sideshow. The real killing was being done by what the Field Artillery School at Fort Sill had spent 15 years building. A fire direction system that allowed any forward observer at the level of a single infantry platoon to call in the concentrated fire of every artillery battalion within range, all firing simultaneously on a single grid square. The Americans called this time on target TOT, What it meant in practice was that an American platoon leader, looking at a hedgerow he could not see into, could pick up a radio, give a 6-digit map coordinate, and have between 1 and 300 shells from 105 mm and 155 mm howitzers detonate inside the target box within 5 to 7 minutes of his request. The German artillery, by contrast, required pre-plotted survey positions and deliberate calculation. An attack from an unexpected direction might proceed for 10 to 15 minutes before German guns could respond effectively. In the fighting for Hill 192 outside St. Lo, the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division alone fired up to 20 time-on-target missions per night to keep the German paratroopers of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division off balance. 20 tots per night in an area perhaps 2 miles wide. The hill, when described by reporters and military historians, was said to look on aerial photographs like a moth-eaten blanket, its edges and tree lines pockmarked, its shape eaten by fire. The German paratroopers in their splinter-pattern smocks were no less concealed than they had been on the first day. They had simply become irrelevant. Their concealment was a property of their bodies. The shells did not care about their bodies. The shells cared only about where their bodies were. When the Americans finally took Hill 192 on July 11, 1944, the 2nd Infantry Division had lost 594 killed and roughly 3,000 wounded across the campaign for the position. The German paratroopers had been wiped out. The hill was littered with German bodies in their excellent camouflage uniforms, killed by an enemy that, in many cases, had never laid eyes on them. In the interrogation reports, the surviving Fallschirmjäger said again and again what their corporals and lieutenants had been saying since June. They could not understand it. Their concealment had not been compromised. They had not been spotted. They had not been outflanked. And yet they were dead, and the men they had been hiding from were walking up the hill. But even the time-on-target system was not the last layer. The Americans had one more thing waiting in their supply chain, a thing the German High Command did not know existed until late December of 1944, a thing that did not just bypass camouflage. It bypassed every form of cover the German riflemen had ever been trained to use. In December of 1944, after the German offensive in the Ardennes had begun, General Dwight Eisenhower made a request that had been on his desk for nearly 2 years. He asked the War Department to lift the restriction on a particular kind of artillery shell. Within 48 hours, the authorization came back. By the end of the month, hundreds of thousands of shells fitted with what the Allies code named the VT fuse were being fed into American howitzers across the front. The VT fuse, or proximity fuse, was a small radio transmitter built into the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell flew, it broadcast a continuous signal. When the signal reflected back from the ground with sufficient strength to indicate optimal detonation height, the fuse detonated automatically. The result was a perfectly timed airburst between 30 and 50 feet above the target, which sent shrapnel raining straight down on whoever was below. Why does this matter for our story about camouflage? Because the VT fuse did not care about cover, not the kind of cover the riflemen thought of as cover. A man pressed flat against the earth, hidden under brush, hidden inside a hedge, hidden in a shallow foxhole. These were the postures the German infantry assumed instinctively when artillery came in. Those postures had been keeping German soldiers alive since 1914. The fragments from a standard contact fused shell went outward and upward when the shell hit the ground. A man flat on his stomach took the fragments at low angle, often missing them altogether, the steel singing inches above his back. The VT fuse inverted that geometry. The shell detonated above the man. The fragments came down. There was no posture, no concealment, no hedgerow that protected the man from a sky full of falling steel. The chief ordnance officer of the European theater reported that one German patrol in the Hürtgen forest, caught by a massed artillery barrage using the new fuses, was found afterward with 96 bodies that looked as if they'd gone through a meat grinder. The bodies were in concealment. They'd been camouflaged. They'd taken cover. None of it had mattered. Now stack this on top of everything else. The M1 Garand, reconnaissance by fire, time on target, Sherman tanks combing every hedgerow with machine gun fire, forward observers trained down to the platoon level, calling in shells inside of 5 minutes. The German rifleman in his Otto Schick design smock, the perfect product of 15 years of camouflage research, was facing an enemy whose theory of finding him did not require finding him at all. The American system did not have to see the camouflaged man. It only had to know the camouflaged man was somewhere in a defined area. The fire would do the rest. And here is the moment in interrogation reports where the German riflemen's confusion becomes almost philosophical. They were not stupid. They were veterans. They knew, in the way fighting men know, what should kill them and what should not. They had been trained on a model in which detection was the precursor to lethality. When they could not be detected, they should not die. The math broke when they died anyway. The Army's Combat Lesson Series, which collected German prisoner statements throughout 1944, recorded the recurring theme. Surprise at the volume of fire, surprise that artillery seemed to know the location of unobserved positions, surprise that American infantry, which the same prisoners described as cautious, somehow inflicted catastrophic losses without ever appearing to commit to a real attack. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, before he was wounded by Allied strafing in July, had written to the German High Command about exactly this. His phrasing was careful, military, but the meaning is unmistakable. Also in evidence is their great superiority in artillery, an outstandingly large supply of ammunition. Rommel was the most respected practitioner of mobile warfare in the German army. He understood what was killing his men, and what he saw was not infantry skill, not better marksmanship, not even better camouflage. It was a system in which the volume of fire that could be delivered against a suspected position was so prodigious that the question of whether the position was confirmed had become uninteresting. So what could the Germans do? They had built their entire defensive doctrine around concealment plus mortar response. They had no answer to a doctrine that fired without confirmation. They could not produce VT fuses. The British and Americans had spent $400 million on that program. They could not produce the radio communications net that allowed every American battery to fire on a single observer's call. They could not, late in the war, produce ammunition at the volumes the Americans were burning through. The men who wore Otto Schick's masterpiece into Normandy were carrying the future of camouflage. What they were facing was the future of fire. The two technologies were not competing on the same scale. If this story is reaching you, if you've stayed with it through the hedges and the gun lines and the dead men in the hedgerows, please consider hitting the like button. Not for me, for the German riflemen and the American infantry both. The documentary record on both sides is rich enough that we can actually see what happened. The men who lived it deserve to have their experience kept visible. So, we come back to the question the title asked. Why couldn't German riflemen explain how American units found them via camouflage that worked against the British? The answer, which we can now state in full, has nothing to do with a magic American technique for seeing through hedges. It has nothing to do with American snipers being better than German snipers, because they were not. It has nothing to do with American camouflage, which was largely abandoned in the European theater after the first weeks of fighting, because U.S. troops wearing the M1942 herringbone twill in camouflage pattern were repeatedly mistaken at distance for Waffen SS men and shot by their own side. The answer is simpler and stranger. The German riflemen could not explain it because the American army was not, in any meaningful sense, finding him. It was killing him without finding him. This is the fundamental conceptual mismatch. The German camouflage system, brilliant as it was designed to defeat a particular act, the act of being seen. The British Army, fighting in the way the British had been taught to fight since the Boer War, conducted that act constantly. They scanned, they patrolled, they engaged identified targets. Their entire engagement loop ran through human eyes locating an enemy and then a section moving against him. When German camouflage broke that loop, British lethality stalled. The American system was not built on that loop. It was built on the assumption that, in most engagements, the enemy would not be seen at all. So, the doctrine treated location, not visibility, as the operational problem. Where is the enemy in the sense of which patch of terrain? That was the question the American officer asked. Once he had a patch, the rest was procedure. Comb it with machine gun fire, drop mortars on it, call artillery on it, put a Sherman through it. The enemy could be wearing a uniform painted with Schick's most subtle dappled foliage, and it would not matter because the dappled foliage was a property of the man, and the American answer to the man was directed at the patch. This was not American genius. It was American mathematics, and a different theory of what an army was. The men at Fort Sill in the late 20s and early 30s, Major Carlos Brewer, Major Orlando Ward, had built the Fire Direction Center on the proposition that the right way to deliver lethal force was through one central brain coordinating many guns. The men in the infantry schools had built a rifle squad that could put suppressive fire on any suspected location in seconds. The development engineers at Section T of the Office of Scientific Research and Development had built a fuse that detonated above the target, regardless of what cover the target had taken. Each piece by itself was answerable. The Germans had artillery. The Germans had machine guns. The Germans had air bursts in the form of time fuses. What they did not have was the combination integrated down to the level of the platoon leader's radio that the U.S. Army had spent 15 years quietly assembling while the rest of the world was busy losing the peace. When the German Fallschirmjäger went into his concealed position east of Saint-Lô in July of 1944, he was the heir to a tradition that began with the splinter pattern of 1931 and the SS field tests of 1937. He was carrying on his body what represented the absolute high point of soldier-level camouflage research up to the moment in human history. By any neutral measurement, he was nearly impossible to see, and the American forces facing him did not need to see him. So they killed him without seeing him. He died not understanding what had killed him because the framework he'd been trained inside did not contain the possibility. The Germans in the interrogation logs return again and again to a word that post-war military historians have written about as a kind of code, unbegreiflich, incomprehensible. The word is honest. From inside their model, what was happening was incomprehensible. Their model required visibility to precede death. Death was preceding visibility. The world had been turned upside down, and it had been turned upside down not by a weapon, but by a different idea of what it meant for an army to know where the enemy was. The American idea was probabilistic. The German idea was deterministic. The American doctrine accepted that you would never know with certainty where every camouflaged man was hiding, and it built a system of fire delivery dense enough to make that acceptance survivable. The German doctrine assumed that if it could not be seen, it could not be hit. Both were right inside their own assumptions. Only one was right inside the assumptions that obtained in Normandy in 1944. Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict on the German rifleman in the hedgerow. He did not fail. His camouflage did not fail. His training did not fail. The theory of warfare he'd been raised on failed, and it failed in a particular way against an opponent who had decided 2 decades earlier that finding the enemy first was an obstacle to lethality, not a precondition of it. There is a final irony. The British, who suffered most against the German camouflage system, fought a war the Germans understood. Their losses were losses inside a shared framework. Both sides agreed on the rules. The Germans were simply better at that moment at hiding inside those rules. The Americans, who killed most efficiently against the same German camouflage, fought a war the Germans did not understand. The losses they inflicted were losses outside the shared framework. The Germans were not better or worse at the American game. They were not playing it. That is the answer to the title's question. German riflemen could not explain how American units found them through camouflage that had worked against the British because the American units were not finding them in any sense German doctrine recognized. The Germans had perfected the art of being invisible. The Americans had simply stopped looking. Bring back the rifleman from the opening. He is in his hedgerow east of Saint-Lô. He's wearing the splinter pattern. He has done everything correctly. And the mortar round detonates over him because 3 hedgerows back, an American forward observer has called in fire on a grid square that probably contains someone in it. The grid is the target. The man is incidental. The grid will be saturated regardless of whether the man is identified. He will die without being seen. He could not explain it. We can. The explanation is that he was facing an army that had stopped asking his question. The American army did not want to know where each German was. It only wanted to know where each German might be and to deliver enough fire that the difference no longer mattered. If this forensic audit has given you something to think about, hit the like button. It helps this channel reach viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the version where one army was simply better, but the version where 2 different theories of warfare met in the bocage, and one of them turned out to address a question the other had not yet thought to ask. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the story of how the American fire direction system was built is the story of an idea that won a war without ever being given a name most people recognize. And remember the German rifleman in the hedge. He was very good at his job. He'd been issued the best camouflage on the planet. His training had been thorough, and he died inside his concealment because he was the last good answer to a question the war had stopped asking. The camouflage worked. The framework around it did not. The men who fought in those hedgerows, German and American both, left us a record clear enough to understand. They deserve to be remembered through it by name where we have names, by deed where we do not. If this analysis of the invisible war in the hedgerows has changed how you perceive the history of the battlefield, please subscribe and like the channel. We are uncovering the tactical secrets and the hidden logic that the official records often overlook. Join us as we dig deeper into the history they tried to bury. The next archive is waiting to be opened.